Welcome to this panel where we'll be speaking about the experiences of launching a new agency in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic and all of the challenges that come with that. So joining us today, we have James Murphy, who's a co-founder of New Commercial Arts, which he has launched with David Golding, who the pair previously founded adam&eveDDB. Then we have Denise Rossetto, one of the co-founders of Broken Heart Love Affair, an agency that's been put together by, I think it's fair to say, some of the kind of most highly regarded talent in Canada. Previously, she was the CCO at BBDO Toronto for 5 years. And then last but not least, we have Ari Halper, who is the former North American creative partner of FCB and one of the brains behind Burger King's Whopper Detour from last year. Was it last year or the year before? And you've left to launch Source Idea Lab. So thanks for all of you for joining me today. To get started, I thought we'd just talk about, the inspirations behind, I think all three of you were in bigger kind of network agencies before. So the inspirations behind actually leaving and setting up your own thing. Ari, I thought it would be kind of interesting to start with you, because I think that your circumstances were a bit more sudden and kind of influenced by the coronavirus pandemic, and that kind of led to you kind of venturing out on your own. So maybe you could speak about that experience and why it was the right thing to do.
Sure. Well, one of the biggest motivating factors was losing my job amidst the pandemic. So as they say, necessity is the mother of invention. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't that I hadn't thought about going out on my own, especially in the tougher years of trying to turn FCB around. And I had seen and learned, even going back to my days at Gray before FCB, I'd seen a number of things within the agency model, within the big global networks that I felt didn't have to be as challenging or complicated as they were. Things like scoping, things like the way in which pitching is handled. Those ultimately were things that I wanted to see if there was a way around, and I tried to push back and rethink them at FCB, but it was very challenging when you're inside a system like IPG or WBP. They all kind of follow very similar guidelines with regards to such things. And this was ultimately, I guess, the universe telling me now's the time to, make the leap and see if your ideas are doable.
Okay. And then how about you, Denise? How long has this been in the works for you, and what was the main inspiration behind you venturing out on your own?
It works, I think, around September of last year. I started meeting with Jay and Carlos. Jay is the strategist, and I had worked with him at DDB before, and I really admired his work. Carlos was at Cassette and did a complete turnaround of the agency. He's actually married to, not married, he's not married. He's my husband's partner, so that was a bit of an odd thing. But they came to me in September, and I was actually quite happy at BBDO. I really liked the work we were doing. I loved the department. I too felt that there were challenges with scoping, and there were things that I didn't feel, I felt that we could be doing things differently for our clients, but you're kind of set up to give the client what they're asking for, not always necessarily what I think is the right thing to do for a client. But like I said, I was super happy there. And when the guys came to me, I thought it was going to be a hard no. I still felt that there was a lot of things I could do at BBDO and wanted to do, but it wasn't a hard no. Immediately when I started talking to them, my gut just kept saying, do this. And my gut clearly has no clue when pandemics are coming. So I now know maybe not to listen to my gut as much. But they made me fall in love with what I loved about the business. I got into the business because of an ad called If You Let Me Play. It was a Nike ad. And I loved it because it wasn't about shoelaces and shoes. It was true branding. And that's what we want to do, is we want to create work that I love again. And it was talking to them made me fall in love with the business again. And I realized that I needed that right now.
Okay. And then James, obviously you and David have gone into business together before. So why was, well, not now, but a couple of years ago, the right time for you to kind of venture out again?
I think that we felt that we'd started Adam and Eve kind of 10, 11 years earlier, and it had gone from sort of obviously being the smallest agency in the UK to, by the time we left, it was the biggest. And we'd had a whole slew of unexpected awards, you know, at Cannes and Effies and IPA effectiveness and so on. But really the main thing was, it was then just the whole group that we were running was just over 700 people. And we'd stopped being practitioners, we'd become HR managers. And not only was that quite miserable, it's also not the thing that we're good at. And so we felt that kind of bailing out and going back to the beginning of this kind of Darwinian cycle would be the way of getting back to what we were really good at and being practitioners.
Okay. And then this is a question to the three of you. When you realized that lockdown was coming, and you were kind of getting ready to launch your agencies, actually maybe Ari, I don't know how much this one will apply to you, but just personally, kind of what was your emotion when you saw that happening around the time of launching your new business that had been in the works for so long?
Denise,
sure.
Go.
I was going to say, it's, you know, there was definitely aspects of fear around it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I actually felt like it played into my hand, because my intention was to actually work with a different set of companies, to not just work direct with brands, but work with digital agencies, media companies, production companies, etc., and all across the world, not just US based, not just in a specific market, which were other things that I wanted to do differently than the agencies that I worked for in the past. And this ability to work remotely and with anyone around the world, it makes no difference whether I'm in Westport, Connecticut, or in Western Africa. It makes no difference. You know, the time zone's a little bit, but other than that, and as a result, I am working with people in South Africa, I'm working with people in Mumbai, and it's great in some respects. It's sort of like the future came rushing in faster than any of us expected. Like it came overnight in some respects.
And then James, how about you? What were you thinking when it kind of was first kicking in?
I think because it was quite frustrating in the sense that we were probably about 6-7 weeks off launching.
Yeah.
And we'd worked a year's notice period, having resigned. And then we had a year's non-compete, so gardening leave. And, you know, so we were really, really kind of chomping at the bit to get going. And then just as we got into that final run-up period, where we were thinking, right, you know, let's get some space, let's make those first hirings, let's get the gang together. And then suddenly everything locked down. And so it felt potentially very, very frustrating. It probably turned out to be less so, but at the time it was pretty worrying.
And Denise, do you have anything to add to that?
It was just surreal, because my last day at BBDO was the Friday. I just was carrying my box out, and I was hoping to say goodbye to everybody, but they were all gone. And we were supposed to open about 2 weeks, 2 to maybe a month. Sorry, I just lost the connection. Sorry. We were supposed to open about a month after the lockdown, but we decided to, and it was a month, but it was a little bit frustrating as well. But creatively, your mind just starts to go into overdrive. You're not sleeping, you're texting each other. We never got to work with each other. We've never been in the same room except the day we signed our shareholders agreement with our masks on. We've never been in the same room, but somehow your mind just, I don't know about you guys, but just creatively went really on overdrive. How are we going to do this? The biggest question for me was, how appropriate was it? We still wanted to launch, and we were still going to launch, but I was really struggling with, this is really serious, and people are you know, people are potentially dying. It felt very odd to be self-promotional. but we had to open as well. So I had issues with, is this the right thing to do? But I think in the long run, it was the right thing to do.
That's actually one question I was going to ask you. As you know, it's part of launching a new business is you need to market the fact that you have a new business, and you need to tell people, and people need to know about it. So was that a reservation that James and Ari, did that cross your mind at all when you were getting ready to launch and go public?
I think that in a funny kind of way, I think we felt it was an interesting launch pad. And, you know, in a world where every agency launches and says, you know, we're really different because, we actually launched and we said, we're really different because we're all cardboard cutouts in our photograph. We just did a team shot where we were all, and it immediately provided a talking point and a kind of point of interest, because people were going, here's a startup that's coming out of the kind of epicenter of the COVID crisis. And we got some good industry coverage, but actually we got a half page in the Sunday Times paper here, which is quite a big deal. Yeah. And with the photo and so on, because they were interested in how startups were approaching this utterly unique situation. So I suppose we were quite opportunistic about it in terms of looking at it and going, we can use the sort of uniqueness of this situation to create energy around the launch.
Well, I'll echo what Denise said. I mean, I guess I somewhat fall right in between Denise and James in that, on the one hand, part of me felt a little bit like, I don't know, dirty or an ambulance chaser. Like, how could I be trying to drum up business in the midst of all of this with clients and like, well, hey, your budgets are shrinking. I'm a lot cheaper than, you know, the big agency that you're currently with. It just, something just felt so tone deaf at that moment. But at the same time, there was a part of me like nagging in the back of my head that, well, at the same time, you are also offering them a solution. You are offering them great creative at a different financial model that makes more sense for the tenor of the times. And it's, I guess, naive to think that every marketer should just go dark for the next 3 months. So ultimately, I pushed past that fear and filthiness.
It's really interesting that the two of you are both creatives and you're both troubled by this. Whereas as the account handler, I don't think it crossed my mind that there was any moral problem with any of this. And I almost looked at it the opposite way. I felt it was our Darwinian duty to get out there and kind of surge into the kind of flow and keep the engine turning. And I don't think there was for a second any question that this was inappropriate. Probably quite the opposite, that it was important for startups to happen.
Yeah. I think within our gang, it's so interesting you say that, because within our gang, we had different points of view. And I think I was struggling with it quite a bit, and thank God for the gang around me who some of them felt the way you did. And the people that came to support us and wanted us to succeed, and wanted something from people in the industry to clients. They wanted this to happen. They were promoting us to promote ourselves. They wanted something positive, and that helped me. I don't know if that helped you too, Ari, but it helped me realize that what we were doing was the right thing right now.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, there are a couple of clients who've been very supportive, and ultimately, I do think that's what got me over the hump to James's side.
If anything, traditionally, I feel like it should be flipped.
Yeah.
I think, James, you should be the one that should be maybe a bit more conservative.
Yeah.
This is something that the three of you have kind of touched on a bit there. Like, obviously, one, I don't know if benefit is the right word, but aspect of launching a new business at this time is obviously clients' needs and resources are changing quite rapidly at the moment. And you've actually got the opportunity to kind of build a business around that, to what they need right now. So I guess what does that actually look like for each of your businesses at the moment? feel free to shoot, whichever one is feeling. But does that make sense as a question? Like, obviously, you know, if you're within a bigger agency, things are quite set in stone, and the ways that people work, and you're obviously quite reliant on the clients that you have as well. Whereas I guess you're a bit freer to be a bit more nimble and flexible in the way that you do work, and kind of adapt to what is happening in the market at the moment.
Sure. Well, I'll jump in since no one else is. The intention, it actually jived pretty well with the intention of creating sauce, and actually why the name is what it is that sauce, if you think about it, is a collection of ingredients designed to go with a specific dish, right? And I equate everything to food because I'm a huge foodie, which is also why it's called sauce. But the intention is to be able to partner with different companies and be fluid, a la sauce, with different creative talents that I found myself unable to work with in the agency model. So if you think about it, it's somewhat naive or ridiculous to think that the best talent in every possible position is at one company, anywhere in the world. You might have killer writer, you might have a killer art director, you might have several killer people, you might have killer strategists, but to have the best of the best at every single skill point is not tenable. No one could afford to have the best talent in every single position. And so you settle for what you can afford within your budgets and such. But if you're not held to that, and you're also even held to, you can only work with the companies that, if you're like IPG, you can only work with other IPG companies. You can only work with other WP companies if you're WPP, etc. Whereas where I am now, I can work with whoever I want. I can pull in people directly from other companies, even if they're already employed at the other company. I can pull in freelancers who I know are vetted and great, as opposed to just who's available at the time, because unfortunately, as we all know, having used freelancers, is that oftentimes the really great ones are busy because they're really great. And so you get who's available as opposed to who's really great, unless you know who you need really far out, versus having a stable of people who I can tap into. And then I can ultimately craft the team based on what the client wants and needs, and not have them pay for anything else. Because if a client came in through the door of a big agency and they're really a firm believer in film, like video, and that's it. If they go to a big agency that's full service, they're still paying to some degree for the overhead to have on staff a social team. They're still paying to have a global department, the lawyers, etc., all these other things that they may or may not ever use. And so what this allows me to do is keep costs down, but talent up.
That's something that Denise or James that you can reason with?
I think what I'm noticing that the clients want, or clients that are calling us, is they want simplicity right now. They don't want a lot of layers. They want a lot of confidence. They're nervous. Some of them realize that they haven't been paying as much attention to their brand as they needed to pay attention to. And now during this crisis, they're asking, now what? Now what do we do? Because you're seeing some of the brands that have done an amazing job at branding are weathering this a little bit better. And access to senior people. And I loved what James was saying earlier about in the position as a chief creative officer at a place, you start become a little bit more about HR. And in this case, I've been sitting with the clients, and all my time has been helping them through this time period versus dealing with a lot of the other issues that I might have to deal with in a larger place. And I think the clients are just feeling so much attention, and that we're a partner with them through this difficult time. And I think they're really looking for that. One client meeting, they called us experts, and I don't think I've heard that in 10 years.
I suppose our sort of thinking about, the way that we shaped ourselves for launch was that we'd worked with a number of clients where we saw that the marketing director, if you like, was having to stretch further and further across their organization, and this sort of emergence of the chief customer officer rather than a chief marketing officer. And so the work that we were doing, we were creating strategic platforms and ideas that were then not just articulated through communications, but also through the customer experience and the customer journey, things like websites or apps or even retail experiences and so on. And so we felt there was a place in the market for an agency that brought the kind of best-in-class strategic thinking, but to bear not just on creative communications, but the experience creatively of a brand in all sorts of places. And that seems to have chimed quite well with clients. We picked up our first client, quite a major one. And interestingly, that client, their role has changed from being the head of marketing to the head of customer experience in the last 6 months. And they looked at the offer and thought, great, this is effectively, this dovetails with my new remit. So,
with regards to winning new clients, just pragmatically, how have you found that process, you know, during lockdown and navigating that remotely? What lessons have you learned from doing that?
I can talk to that and say it's been probably a more positive and effective experience than I'd expected. I thought it was going to be terrible trying to work remotely when one of the pitches can be very pressurized, but one of the best things about it is that the gang gets into a huddle and they kind of nut things through until they get to some really exciting ideas. It was interesting how the kind of virtual tools that we're using, whether it's Zoom or Hangouts or the other things, actually made that quite possible. The only thing I think I've found is that it can be a bit relentless, constantly doing things on these channels, because you don't have at least if you go and do a meeting or you do a kind of get together, you then get on the underground and travel somewhere, or get on your bike and go somewhere. Whereas here you kind of go to the bathroom and then come back and that's it, you know.
Yeah, I can reason with that. Definitely. Denise, Ari, do you have any experiences of, you know, winning new business or just generally, speak to
I
that.
echo James. It's been a lot more positive than I thought. In person, you can read a room a little bit better. You can get a feeling for how people are reacting, even though Zoom's great. There's this intangible thing that is nice in pitches, that energy. But at the very beginning, Carlos, one of the partners, made us go on to this whiteboard app. He was adamant. They were completely stressed out that I was going to end up losing all the work somehow, which I didn't. But so we've been bringing clients along in a much looser, we've been inviting them to our whiteboards and letting them share the insides of our minds. And we've been having so much fun just being a little bit looser and more collaborative with them. And so you find your way. Although I still think that the energy is nicer in person.
Okay. Ari, you want to add anything to that?
Sure. I'll be a little bit more negative than both of them are like, yes, this is great. I found it, two sides to it. I found finding new clients, creating new relationships harder, but I found working in this model this way through Zoom, Google Meets, phone calls, what have you, relatively seamless. It actually, I almost don't even notice it to some degree. I mean, yes, there are certain things I'll agree with Denise, like, being in the room with someone and having that alchemy. I definitely miss that. You miss the social nature of it, and there are certain drawbacks to it, but for the most part, it has been surprisingly seamless, I'll say.
Okay. And I don't want to dwell on remote working because I think it's something that's been, especially within our industry, covered quite a lot. But on top of, working remotely, what lessons have you learned in these few months that maybe you think you wouldn't have had the opportunity to learn if things had launched during like a normal time? Is there anything that's kind of stuck with you that maybe will kind of stick with you in in the years to come as the agency builds?
Do you want me to go first?
Go for it.
Okay. I think that, funnily enough, I think remote working has, on one level, it's leveled up smaller and startup agencies versus their big competitors, because it's very democratizing as a media. You know, you occupy the same amount of real estate on this screen, whether you're the CEO of a top 5 agency or someone doing a startup. And I think, but equally, I think it's also probably short-circuited some of the bullshit in big agencies as well, because, you know, the big guy with the corner office with the swivel leather chair is the same as everyone else. He's sitting in the spare room at home with his kids disturbing him and a dog barking in a distance. And that's a healthy thing. I think it's removed some of the nonsense trappings of our industry. And so some of the advantages you have of a startup have probably been removed via these kind of medium.
Anyone else want to add to that?
I think that it's just, it's made us have to be completely flexible, be more creative in our thinking, especially when it comes to production. I think for me personally, it's probably made me a better listener, because interrupting on Zoom looks the worst. So I think that's a good thing. And also, one thing I'd like to incorporate when we go back is just space to think. So I will get up in the middle of the day and go for a bike ride or go for a walk, and it's so important to get that thinking time instead of just reacting. And I don't think I built that into my day enough before. And I'd really like to, when we all get back into the space, is to make sure that there's space for thinking, not constantly being around people.
I can reason with that. I think there's a fine balance between the two, right? I do miss being around people, but being able to get up in the morning and go for a stroll rather than have to rush for the train and run to the office, I think there's a lot to say for that. But yeah, the thing about dogs as well, I mean, I've had to kind of hide my 3 away for this call, because otherwise it would be carnage. Okay, and then an important part of launching a new business is, on top of making it work as a kind of financially viable business, is you need to kind of nurture a culture within it. I think is kind of an important part of any company. You know, Denise, you've only been in the same room once as your partners. James, I'm not sure exactly how long you spent with yours, and Ari, what your situation is like, but how are you actually going about and kind of nurturing that culture without the opportunity to kind of hang out and maybe go for a beer or even just chat over a coffee for 10 minutes?
I think for me, it's been one of the more frustrating parts of it, because, as I said, one of the real joys about being in a startup is that gang mentality that it's very, very, can be quite intense, but in a really good way, an exciting way. And often that's because you're all squashed into a loft somewhere like Soho in London and, trying to do work at high speed together. And so I think whilst these channels have actually worked quite well, they have become quite transactional. So the thing is that the idea of we're doing work on Zoom and, oh, right, let's have Friday afternoon drinks on Zoom as well. You're kind of like, do you know what? Not so much, because this is where and how we do business, and it doesn't feel like the place that you want to do and so when we want to pitch, we really wanted to go to the pub, and that's not because we're alcoholics, but because we wanted to be with each other and celebrate stuff. And so I think there's been a bit of denial of that nicer part of the dynamic. But equally, the stuff that we've won has been so busy that every morning there's a kind of 9 o'clock team get together, 10 o'clock there's one with the clients, and then we're into kind of production and planning meetings and things like that. So there is a rhythm already, and quite a lot of stuff happening. So we're building some sense of culture around that, but I'd say perhaps we haven't paid enough attention to the softer side of things.
Ari or Denise?
Sure. I'll say that I feel like there's been more of a culture of generosity, a spirit that we're all in this together. More so, when you're working in an office in an agency, I feel like you can't help but feel like you're working for a company, you're working for a boss. Whereas in this dynamic, I feel like it's like us against the pandemic, if you will, up against the odds. And the collaboration, the freedom of people speaking their minds, their voice, I feel like it is actually helped in many ways to create a flatter culture. I mean, similarly to something that James was saying about it leveling the playing field between big agencies and startups, I actually feel like there's also been sort of a level of playing field between bosses and employees, if you will, and that everyone just, you feel like you're really in it together. There's empathy, more than I feel like I've ever seen, and everyone seems to be rooting for small agencies like ourselves, and that's just it's great fuel to your fire to keep going because of that genuine positivity and wanting to help you succeed.
Denise, you want to add anything to that?
I feel the same way as both James and Ari. We're a super tight group, especially the 5 partners. I mean, we're very tight and we can finish each other's sentences. And but at the same time, and I do feel like this camaraderie, and we all have the same intentions, and we're rooting for each other, which is really nice. But I also agree with James, and I'm really curious as what's going to happen to some of the organizations that have decided never to go back into an office, which I'm reading about, because I really don't know how you create a culture for the people that may not be the founding people. How do you create a culture for them? How are they mentored? How do they learn? How do you celebrate your successes? I'm really, really curious as how some of the tech companies who are saying they're going to be 100% virtual, what is that culture? I can't even imagine what that would be. And I feel that I feel that it's a frustrating part right now is not to be able to create that culture for the people who are working with us.
Yeah, I think there's also the sense in which people have talked about having a much healthier balance. So working from home and that flexibility is healthy and so on. But it's also healthy to have a separation between home and work. And the idea that you go somewhere and you do your work, and then you go somewhere else and you don't do your work. Yeah. And so I think it's, as ever, we are an industry where people race after fads really vocally the whole time. And I think what might be the answer is just something a bit more gentle and a bit more flexible, where we say the office or the agency becomes somewhere where people truly gather for creative moments, when being together and sparking off each other really is important and you really need it to happen. And then there are other, perhaps more reflective parts of your job where you can retreat to your cocoon and do that on your own.
Yeah. I guess as a kind of final question, if you could kind of look, this is kind of a difficult question actually, because the rest of the year is incredibly uncertain for pretty much everyone, but what does the rest of the year hold in store for your agency? But also, I guess thinking a bit more broadly, how do you see the market for independent agencies kind of shaping over the next 6 months to a year, and the kind of opportunities and the opportunities for independent agencies in the coming 6 months to a year?
Well, if the year of 2020 has taught me anything, it's to not try to predict what's going to happen in the future. From not just the pandemic, but to the riots now in the streets, and I'm just waiting for the locusts to come next. But I do genuinely think that the industry will be forever changed. I think that I'm starting to hear from, obviously I have a lot of friends in a lot of different agencies, that employees don't want to go back into the office, or they only want to go, in 2 days a week. And I believe this remote working shift will only become more and more pervasive. And I think there are certain agencies that are just better set up to do that than others. And I do agree, harkening back to what James said, is that I do think that there will be more of a level playing field, and that there will be more smaller shops and less bigger shops. I think that bigger shops will predominantly serve giant global clients, or clients that just churn out a ton of work. But then again, those may ultimately just build their own in-house agencies to some degree. But that it's after each one of these crazy shifts in history. I remember after 2008, 2009, even after the economic downturn, after 9/11, the industry shrinks, and then it never really grows back to the size that it was. They learn, hey, we can get by with half the staff doing twice the work. Let's stay that way. And I think that there's going to be learnings from this, and like, hey, we don't necessarily have to go back this way. We can actually subsist. Our brand can thrive with a small agency. We don't need the big agency per se.
I thought there was an interesting development with I think the news, is it Keith Cartwright, who was running 72 and Sunny, and he's launched an agency that sort of, whilst it's sort of legally, financially under the WPP umbrella, it's a sort of startup, part funded by them, and clearly part of the thinking in that is that there is a role where holding companies plug in, almost like a piece of very dynamic software. An agency like that is plugged into the bigger infrastructure for when it's needed, and then unplugged to carry on doing its own independent thing. And I think that's an interesting development, and perhaps particularly where you've got certain parts of the industry are almost becoming perhaps a bit more like the traditional media planning and buying part, where scale does really matter. So things like programmatic and performance marketing and data, where heavy investment in heavy technology is creating something where scale does make a difference, but also it's creating quite commoditized offerings. And the only way to really show value to clients is to say, yes, we've got the big infrastructure, we've got the efficiency, but we've got access to these magic bands of people that we can plug in as and when we need them. And so I think there might be a new, not just collaboration, but coexistence between smaller startup agencies and the holding companies.
Like a kind of cooler sub-brand to the big brand. Yeah. And Denise, do you want to say anything to that?
Well, I think what James was saying makes perfect sense. And I've always wondered why that wasn't sort of happening a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
But things happen faster when things like this happen. All the things I thought should have been happening, like a little bit more of a gentler, flexible work environment. I've been kind of advocating for that for a long time for people. Now it's happening. And also what James was just talking about too, I thought that might have happened a couple of years ago, and now it's happening. So I think things like this, a crisis, although terrible things happen, I think it can also push you towards some of the things that should have been happening earlier. So I'm excited by some of those opportunities. I do think that clients are really going to look for value again, and I think that's going to be great for us as an independent agency, because I think we can provide what they're looking for a little bit faster, easier, and just finding better ways to work. But I also think out of times of this, a lot of creative ways of thinking come out, a lot of creative solutions come out. I just feel like people's minds are on overdrive right now. You're seeing a lot of creativity from people who aren't in even creative businesses, just with how to deal with the economy and things like that. I find that very inspiring to see that. I'm trying not to get down about some of the negatives that could come out of it, although I'm a total realist and I know I'm trying to inspire myself by some of the positives that can come out of this for our clients and for independents in general.
I think, yeah, okay. I think there have been, like, I think from an emotional standpoint, like the last few months have been intensely stressful at times, but also I think I've learned a lot about people, and I've become closer to a lot of people, even though I've only seen, I would say, the same kind of 4 people in the last 3 months. I've become a lot closer to a lot of people. And I think that kind of includes my colleagues, even people like you three. Possibly we wouldn't be on the same call or even in the same room or chatting right now if we weren't in the middle of this crazy pandemic. So I think there's been some kind of nice aspects to come out of it. But yeah, thank you very much. I think that I've got everything that we need for that. Thank you very much for joining our panel today.